service coordinators developing IPPs, sometimes we're in a home once every 3 years for about 2 hours. That doesn't give you a whole lot of time to gather a lot of information, so there is a need to depend on other sources of information that may be closer and have more contact with the individual. Maintain a person-centered approach, value input from all members of the planning team. Sometimes there can be contradictory information provided at times, and when faced with that, we either need to make observations and assessments to figure out which one lies closest to the truth, or sometimes just cite the different sources and the disagreements that might be presenting different information. We're required to reflect the awareness of and sensitivity to the lifestyle and cultural background of the consumer and the family. And I have some examples, but to try to keep on track with our timeline, I'm going to skip over some of the situations you might encounter in that setting. Make certain the IPP process focuses on the positive. When we talk about goal statements, I'm going to expand on that concept a little bit. And whenever possible, assessments should be conducted in the consumer's natural environment. What is the consumer's natural environment? You know, what's mine and yours natural environment? It's wherever we spend most of our time during the day, given that particular day or schedule. So in the evenings, I'm at home at my family residence, and during the day, I'm at work at the regional center. So if I were to conduct an assessment about my work skills, I'd want to have a meeting at my job site. Bringing the planning team together. Who are the team members? At minimum, it's the consumer, their authorized representative if they have one. If not, they have the authority as a legally responsible adult to make decisions on their own behalf, and the regional center service coordinator. Who else might be included in a planning team? Family members, friends, neighbors, co-workers, service providers, support persons. By the time you get down to the final bullet, it's anybody that the consumer wants present. And we try to accommodate that as much as possible. Obviously, if people's schedules are prohibitive, we might have to conduct a meeting without all desired and requested members there and make plans to get information outside of the planning team. What I want to emphasize is what does not constitute a planning team, and that would be any meeting that did not involve the consumer. So the service coordinator and the service provider can't get together and decide what they think is in the best interest of the consumer and make changes to the levels of services and supports that an individual is receiving in their IPP. And the consumer and the service provider don't constitute a planning team either. There needs to be representation from the regional center as the agency with responsibility to provide the funding to agree to recommendations made by service providers and consumers. That doesn't mean these meetings can't occur. You can certainly have information exchanged outside of a planning team, but you can't change an IPP without, at minimum, the consumer and the regional center representative present and documenting that agreed change. Required components of the IPP. This is defined in legislation. Whether you look at an IPP developed at Alta California Regional Center or one of the other regional centers throughout the state of California, they're all going to have these components. They might be called different things, they might be formatted differently, but ultimately you're going to find this information embedded somewhere in that document. It's a statewide standard in Welfare and Institutions Code. IPPs include assessments, goals, objectives, and services and supports. By the way, any training that you ever receive on IPPs is likely going to be referencing material from the law, which is straight from the horse's mouth. If you're interested in checking out what the law has to say about the IPP process, this is a hyperlink, so when the PowerPoint becomes available to you, you can click on it and be directed to Welfare and Institutions Code section 46.5, which will describe, again, straight from the horse's mouth, the legislation that mandates what goes into an IPP. What I've extracted from it, and I don't think anyone would disagree, is that the components required are the assessment, goals, objectives, and services and supports. What is the assessment component of an IPP? It's a little different than what you might think of in terms of maybe a specific assessment of a person's skill level in a specific area, like a speech and language assessment or an occupational therapy assessment. What regional center service coordinators assess when they work with a consumer are their life goals and preferences, capabilities and strengths, any barriers, concerns, or problems that might exist, and their general health status. We also try to get a picture of what the expected outcomes for a service may be. There is no one standard assessment tool to gather this information. So when the service coordinator goes out to meet with the regional center consumer, actually the only standard assessment tool that we have is the CEDR, the Client Development Evaluation Report. And if we were to base our IPP document on information we gathered by completing the CEDR, I think we'd fall short of achieving our mission of putting together a plan that looks at all the individuals' areas of life that they want to work on. So how do we conduct the assessment? It's generally conducted through conversations. And again, I'm reminded of what Carol Risley said about how, as originally social workers gathered information by just having conversations. After the assessment's conducted, the other components of the IPP are the goals, objectives, and the services and supports. Quick overview of these. Goals are pretty general. They just sort of point us in the direction of where we want to go. Objectives are a little more specific, and they allow measurement of progress, which is another mandate for selecting and continuing a service. And finally, the list of services and supports that tell who's going to be responsible for achieving the objectives, essentially who's responsible for what by when. The goals in an IPP are based on needs, preferences, and life choices of the individual with developmental disabilities. That's, again, taken directly from the Welfare and Institutions Code that describes the IPP process. So with those parameters, if you're going to write a goal statement for someone, and what you're taking into consideration are their needs, their preferences, and their life choices, are there any restrictions that are placed on that, or does anything go? I'll throw out my 2 cents on that. And one is that, again, IPPs need to focus on the positive, so we wouldn't include an IPP goal that had any illegal activity or anything that promoted self-harm or harm to the community. Rather, I would challenge a planning team to ask what it is at the day program that might be very valuable and beneficial to attend that you're going to achieve and get out of that so that you can lead that independent, normal, productive life. So it's okay to need or want to attend a day program, but as far as a future and a desired outcome, we need to know what it is that day program is going to provide, and that's what our documentation needs to start reflecting. Goal statements should be expressed in the consumer's own voice as much as possible. With these being the only parameters that they're based on needs, preferences, and life choices, and my 2 cents on we aren't going to do anything illegal or that would pose a threat to the community or themselves, and that we aren't going to foster dependence with a goal. Any goal that a consumer wants to achieve could potentially be included in an IPP. You might, as a planning team, and again, Carol Risley talked about the consumer that wanted to be the nurse that ended up volunteering at the hospital. You might be faced with things that you might consider unrealistic. Well, it's not our job to determine whether or not someone's goal for the rest of their life is unrealistic or not. Time will be the judge of that. What we can do as a member of the planning team is talk about what the interests are, and I usually talk about a 2-prong approach to address this issue. One is finding out what the interest is of the individual and if there are other ways to achieve it that might offer a less challenging path and the same outcome. Or 2, if you do have to go down a path that involves higher education, acquiring complicated skills, you identify what the next step in that process might be and work towards that, and then let time be the judge of whether or not it's realistic. When we get to developing objectives in an IPP, there are a few more restrictions. It's no longer just based on needs, preferences, and life choices. Now we've added a layer of sort of regulation and definition, and objectives in an IPP need to be statements of specific time-limited objectives for implementing the person's goals, and they need to be stated in terms that allow measurement of progress or monitoring service delivery. With that added layer of definition or restriction, we have to ensure that these standards are met in the documentation. We developed an acronym to help people measure or test an objective to see if it meets the standard of being specific, measurable, aligned, realistic, and timely. And that would be a S.M.A.R.T objective. Specific, hopefully specific enough that two people looking at the same measure would agree that it's been accomplished. Measurable, stated in terms that someone can come back a year later and determine whether or not progress has been made. Aligned, in that it would coincide with the goal statement, so you're working on something that ultimately points you in the direction of your desired outcome. Realistic, in that we're not biting off more than we can chew in the time frame given, and timely, in that it's not going to drag on indefinitely. I'm going to try to wake everybody up with a quick exercise. Shouldn't take more than 5 minutes, and if you take anything away from my presentation, I hope this will be it. So it requires a willing suspension of disbelief. Is everyone familiar with that concept? Anyone want to explain it? Willing suspension of disbelief. Throw all your doubts out. It's what makes action movies enjoyable to watch. We aren't going to bring reality into this situation. Imagine, if you will, rather than a system of delivery that focuses on promoting independent, normal, productive lives, imagine a system that's sole purpose is to develop shapes, all right? So that's our charge. It's a little easier to measure shapes than it is human development. So this is going to illustrate my example more quickly and easily. So if anybody has scratched note paper, I want you to take your pen to it and draw a shape for me, please, within 30 seconds. Shape.